In this episode, we're going to take a look at all the pro-level lavalier microphones I've worked with, just give you my impressions. Now, in this case, we're going to just talk about my impressions of these different pro-level lavalier microphones that I've worked with. They start at $200, they go up from there. They top out somewhere around the $550 range, just so you understand where we're coming from. These are just my impressions. I've got links down below where you can get audio samples from each of these different microphones. Now, I am aware that many of us can't afford these lavalier microphones. So, for example, if you're doing YouTube videos and you're not necessarily making a lot of money, or you're doing friends and family kind of just videos and passion projects and things like that are all entirely self-funded, these microphones don't necessarily make sense unless you have a lot of extra cash lying around. But you can get out there and buy a $20 to maybe $100 lavalier microphone, and you can make some pretty awesome stuff with that. So I don't want to try and convince you that you need a $550 microphone if you're doing passion projects where you're not going to make any money. So let's talk about what makes pro-level lavalier microphones pro. What is special about them? Well, I think a lot of people assume that, wow, they must sound angelic. They must sound amazing because you're paying so much more money. And typically they do sound better than a $20 lavalier microphone. So that's not surprising. But there are some other things that I think are really important. Number one is the quality of the build. They're usually made to be a lot more durable because in the production sound world, these things take a lot of abuse. I can't tell you how many times someone has tried to take their body pack transmitter off and dropped it, and the cable gets yanked, and just all sorts of crazy stuff. They just get a lot of abuse. And so it's really important that they be built well. And not only that, but they should be repairable as well. And in fact, a lot of the pro sound houses that are located in the filming centers throughout the world often have the ability to repair a pro-level lavalier microphone. Secondly, size. Size really makes a difference here because typically for narrative films in particular, we're trying to hide these microphones usually under clothing, in hair, underneath hats, maybe just around somebody's ear, anywhere we can, depending on the situation. And so having a microphone head that's not super large is super important as well. Now, third, they typically have a variety of different connectors that can work with different professional level wireless microphone systems. So they're going to be 3-pin LEMO, 5-pin LEMO, and other types of locking plugs. So it's not just going to be the typical 3.5 millimeter that you would plug into your consumer grade camera. There are other types of connectors. Now, also, because there are so many different types of connectors out there on the pro level wireless systems, they also offer in some cases a micro dot connection, which then allows you to choose which kind of plug you're going to connect to that. So that gives you a little bit more flexibility, especially if you're going to be using different types of wireless systems. So that's another feature that you're going to see on these pro level lavaliers that you're typically not going to find on the consumer grade. Fourth, they put a lot of engineering into making these microphones RF immune. What do I mean by that? There is so much radio frequency energy around us these days. It is astonishing. And of course, you're also creating more when you're using a wireless transmitter. So what's really important is that these lavalier microphones need to be able to be immune to that, to not pick up interference from that radio frequency energy around them. And so typically on the pro level lavalier microphones, they will invest a lot more research and development to make sure that those microphones won't pick up that interference. On the consumer grade ones, especially the really inexpensive ones, the $20 lavalier microphones, that's not usually a consideration. They don't have the money to invest in a lot of research and development. So they just make something that works under the best of circumstances, and it may not work under the circumstances where you have a lot of radio frequency energy. Another thing that you typically find in the pro-level lavalier microphones is they're voiced specifically to be hidden under clothing, or they give you replaceable caps that let you tune the sound of the microphone so that if you do place it under clothing, you can get a little bit more high-frequency energy. So what happens when you put a microphone underneath clothing, the clothing will actually block some of the high frequencies from getting through, and so the recordings can start to sound kind of muffled. A lot of these microphones compensate for that either by the way they've been voiced out of the factory, or they give you these little replaceable caps so you can tune how you want them to sound based on the actor's voice, the talent's voice, or based on the type of clothing that you're hiding them under. So if you're going to go under heavier clothing, you want to maybe use something that gives you a little bit more high frequency energy into that recording, and this allows you to do that. Water resistance is another thing we see a lot more in the pro level lavalier microphones. Now, not that you're going to be out recording in the rain so much, and maybe you are, but I think the biggest thing is sweat. A lot of times actors are put in really demanding situations and they sweat a lot. And of course, they've got a lot of nerves going. They've got a job to do. And so having this water resistance can be really, really helpful as well. And then one last thing is a lot of times they have various color options. As we're trying to hide these lavalier microphones, it's really useful sometimes to have different colors. So for example, if you're going to be miking a bride, you're going to be doing a wedding, they have them in white in some cases. You can get them in black if you're going to be hiding under clothing, or in some cases you can get various skin tones. So if you're going to be running a cable up someone's neck to put the microphone up in their hat or perhaps hide it in their hair, then you have those options as well. So it makes it a little less obvious on the back of their neck. So let's jump over here first to the Sanken, and the Sanken comes in this kind of plastic box, something like this. Here we have a little alligator clip, and there is also a metal grill that you can put on top of the microphone. The Sanken looks something like this. Now, this is an interesting microphone. These have been around for quite some time. I think the first thing that sticks out to me is the beefiness of it. These things are really made to be tough, and they hold up really nicely. I have 2 of these, and I've had them for probably 4 years now, and they have held up really, really well. Still use them to this day. They're still one of my favorite microphones. They're relatively long here, and that's because they actually have a vertical diaphragm design. I believe the diaphragm runs of the length of the microphone body here, as opposed to just a circle that's placed like a typical lavalier microphone. So I think it actually runs this way, and I think the idea is that you get a larger surface area, and therefore they feel like they could voice it to sound better. And so that's kind of a unique thing about the Sanken COS-11D. It is moisture resistant, and as I mentioned before, they did put a good bit of design into this to help it with RF immunity. Now, that's not to say that these are perfect on that front. There has been one occasion in the 4 or 5 years I've been using this microphone where I did pick up some RF interference. I don't know if it was the microphone or the wireless system itself. I think it was the microphone, but it's done pretty well. I would say 1 time out of 4 years is pretty darn good. Again, this one is voiced for hiding it underneath your clothing, so that means it does have a little bit of a presence boost. So you'll hear a little bit more crispness up in the kind of articulation frequencies. Another consideration with lavalier microphones is that often for narrative films or even any sort of professional audio capture, a lot of times we're using redundant microphones. So we have a lavalier microphone on the talent, plus we have a boom microphone on them. Now, the idea for this is that in post, then we can cut between the two and use the mic that sounds best for any given line that the talent delivers. And so what's important in that case is that the ability to cut between the lavalier to the boom, back to the lavalier, and so on and so forth. You don't want to have to do a ton of EQ work in post to get them sounding similar, because you don't want them to sound a whole lot different. So what I have found is that the Sanken generally tends to cut pretty well with a lot of shotgun microphones, especially I think the Sanken microphones. And I think a lot of the manufacturers on the higher end will go to great lengths to kind of voice their microphones in a similar fashion so that cutting between them is a little bit easier. And I think that's probably the case here. This does have a little bit of a brighter sound that does seem to kind of match the Sanken CS3E, which is a very popular shotgun microphone. So anyway, that is a look at the Sanken COS-11D, a microphone that I've had for 4 or 5 years and still gets plenty of use today. Now, next up, we're going to take a look at a microphone that is probably the least expensive of all those that we're going to look at today. This one runs about $200 for the bare bones kit. I think the kit I have costs a little bit more because it has more accessories, but let's take a look at the Voice Technologies VT500. This is a Swiss company. Sanken, the last one we looked at was a Japanese company. This is the VT500. Now you can see it has a kind of a different shape to it. It's a little bit more of a rectangle and a flat design with a front-facing capsule right here. That's a circle you see. This microphone, as I said, you can buy in a bare bones kit, which I think comes just with an alligator clip and the foam wind cover, if I'm not mistaken, and that runs about $200 US. This microphone actually sounds quite good, and I like it quite a bit. It was probably added to my kit after I had the Sankens, but I was just out of curiosity, and it's been a really good mic. Now, this shape actually makes it so that it can be advantageous for hiding under clothing under certain circumstances. So if, for example, I am attaching something to a woman's bra underneath her shirt, this can be a pretty nice shape to work with. And sometimes I actually just even use the alligator clip to do that. Other times you can use what's called a vampire clip. The extended kit comes with this vampire clip. You can see these basically 2 pins that can slide into wardrobe or clothing, and then it holds the mic in place just here. Something like that. So that's pretty convenient. This one's really useful. The vampire clip actually is really useful if I've got someone up on stage, if I'm doing like a presentation. This attaches to people's clothing pretty nicely if they're wearing like a sport coat or something like that. That works pretty nicely. It also comes with this little concealing device here, so you can slide the microphone up into here and then hide this under someone's clothing. And the idea here is that clothing can kind of slide past this without rubbing against the microphone capsule. So that can be a helpful thing as well. And you just put some adhesive on the back here. So there's a look at the VT500, which can be a really good option if you're just getting into doing paid production work. And I definitely think it's worth giving a try. I did do a dedicated review on this one. Again, links down below. Now the next one we're going to look at is a Countryman B6. This is a tiny, tiny, tiny little lavalier microphone. Let's take a closer look here. Just pop this case open here. This actually has 2 mics in it. We're going to look first at the Countryman B6. And in fact, I'm going to move this out of the way for now, just so you can see this and how tiny it is. That is minuscule. If I pull out the Sanken again, just for comparison, the Sanken microphone head next to the Countryman B6. Here's the Sanken, here's the Countryman. So that's really kind of one of its biggest features, is the fact that the Countryman B6 is so tiny. If the number one priority is to be able to hide this effectively, and especially if you've got someone wearing form-fitting clothing, the nice thing about this is not only the microphone head small, but the diameter of the cabling is very small as well, and yet it's still very tough. Now, this one also has various frequency response caps here. We can just kind of pull these out here. So we have a crisp response, which is the one that's on there right now. We have a flat response. And we have a very crisp response. So if you're going to hide under heavy clothing, that one would be the one you'd choose. Typically, I just have the crisp response on if I'm going to be hiding it under one layer of clothing like a shirt, and then flat if you're actually going to have it on the outside of the clothing. One other thing I'd like to point out here is you'll notice that this is actually a micro dot connector. Let me just pull this off here. So this is what's called a micro dot connector. This gives me freedom to choose the type of connector here. So I've got a 3-pin LEMO here, and this is what I need for my audio limited A10 system. And so I can just pop that on there and we're good to go. Now, if I switched over to electrosonic system and I needed a 5-pin LEMO, I just need to buy this connector. Now, the one thing to keep in mind, these connectors are not cheap, but it is potentially cheaper and more convenient than having to send your microphone back in and have it re-terminated with a different type of connector. So that is one advantage of the micro dot. Now, are there any downsides to the Countryman B6? I guess I don't look at it so much as a downside, but one thing to know about this microphone is it can have a very bassy response to it, and especially if you mount it on a man's chest, where you're getting kind of the chest resonance as well, and they have a very deep voice, it can be a little overwhelming. So a lot of times I won't use this nowadays in the center of a man's chest, especially, again, if they have a bassy voice, but I'll move it off to the side, or if I'm hiding it in hair or a hat or something like that, this will be one of the first ones I'll come choose. But again, if I have to hide it on the chest, there are probably other options I'd go for first. Incidentally, this microphone was used, I believe, in the Hobbit movies, and it was put on the kind of the stand-up lapels of some of the characters there. And in fact, they used 2 of them, one on each lapel, so that as the actor turned their heads, they could capture it on either side. So that's the Countryman B6. Now, I do quite a bit of corporate video. In fact, that's the main thing that I do, and I do some short narrative films on the side periodically where I do sort of freelance production or location sound mixing. But when I am doing corporate video, one that I use a whole lot is the DPA 4160, and let me show you that here. Now, this one's kind of interesting, and it may be a little difficult to see, but let me just see if we can get a profile shot on this. This one's actually made so that this little spout here sits behind a button placket, and the little spout sticks through a buttonhole. So you can share this with the button that's already buttoned through the buttonhole, and that makes it very easy to hide. So this one is the one that I go to for corporate interviews, and those cases, a lot of times I'll have people wearing button-down shirts, so this makes a very convenient way to hide without having to dig underneath their clothing a whole lot. So, and especially in corporate video, they're not generally actors that you are miking up. They are corporate executives. And so they're not necessarily used to taking their shirt off to have someone hide a microphone on them. And in some cases, they're a little bit uncomfortable with that. So this makes things a little bit more convenient in those circumstances where you can kind of just stick it underneath the button placket without having them to have to take their shirt off or unbutton a lot of their shirt to get it in place. Now, this one does have a slightly mid-rangey sort of sound to it versus some of the other microphones here, so it's not a perfect fit for every voice. And that's another thing is, you know, you might ask, well, why do you have all these different microphones? Part of it is really so that I have options when it comes time to miking different people's voices. And I kind of choose the microphone based on the timbre of the voice of the person that we are working with, and also based on the particular shotgun or boom microphone that we happen to be using too. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Now, this one cuts nicely, of course, with other DPA microphones, and it just so happens that I use the DPA 4017B as my primary shotgun microphone, so oftentimes this is a good fit with that one as well. Now, one set of microphones, it's relatively new in the film space, and I think it's an interesting story because there's a company called Shure who's made microphones for about 100 years, and they have, at least in the relatively recent past, haven't done a lot in the film space, but it looks like they're trying to make a little bit of a move back into the film space. And in fact, if I understand correctly, some of the engineers that work at Sound Devices were formerly Shure engineers, and I think at some point Shure decided, we're not really going to do any more in the film space. And so those guys left and started Sound Devices. In any case, they now have some new lavalier microphones, which are pretty interesting. In fact, I've been using a fair bit more lately. So this is the TwinPlex TL-47, and this is sort of a general purpose microphone. Let me just pull this out here. You can see there are a variety of different accessories here. We have a little kind of silicone thing that's made for hiding the microphone underneath clothing. Kind of has this, the idea with these is that it provides a little bit of a barrier here so the clothing rubs against the silicone instead of the microphone capsule. I've got one of those, and they've got some adhesive to stick that to people's skin if you needed to do that. It does come with a variety of different things. So here's a couple of alligator clips in different sizes, foam wind cover. And you can see this one is sort of a tan skin color. So that's another thing that they do. This also has a different cap. So this is a presence cap if you're going to hide it underneath clothing and you need a little bit more of that high frequency, or they also have a flat cap if you're going to be putting it on the outside of clothing. What do I like about this microphone? This one's unique from a couple of different perspectives. Let me just pop this cap off there so you can see there. So what's unique about this one is, number one, it's a dual diaphragm design. There are actually two diaphragms in it. And again, they're using two diaphragms so that they can hopefully get a better frequency response overall, is the idea. A little bit more natural sound across the entire frequency spectrum. And I really do like the sound of the TL-47 and the next one we're going to look at as well. So the replaceable caps are nice. It is also water resistant. They use a nano coating on this so that any moisture that comes in contact with the microphone body is not likely to, first of all, get inside the cap and onto the diaphragm, which will affect the audio quality and actually can create distortion and other weird artifacts. This one seems to cut quite nicely with my Sennheiser MKE2 and actually my DPA 4017, but it doesn't sound quite as mid-rangey as the DPA 4160. So I really like the sound of this microphone quite a lot on most voices. So it's overall a pretty even response and a pretty nice sound. So this one I've been kind of choosing this one more and more. In fact, a week and a half ago I was working on a short narrative film, and the actress in that film got to use this one. So it just worked really nicely on her voice. It was easy to hide on her. And we actually went, again, in this case, we were able to attach it to her bra. And that way it kept the clothing, her shirt, from rubbing against it, and just worked really nicely with her voice. Now, in addition to the TL-47, Shure also has the TL-48. And this one is designed specifically for capturing dialogue. So whereas the TL-47 is a little bit more general purpose and could potentially, for example, be used in theater where you might have singing, this one was really made for spoken word dialogue. You can see it does not have the replaceable caps, and it's a slightly different shape. But this one, on a lot of voices, is probably, of all the microphones I have, usually the first one I go to these days. Really like the sound of this one. In this case, it's terminated for my audio limited A10 system here, so that's a hardwired connection. but you can get it in a variety of other connections as well. And then of course it has the foam wind cover, the alligator clips, and the little clips to hold it on the alligator clip, adhesive, the silicone mount here. So this one's become a favorite very quickly. I just started using these earlier in 2019, and they've become a real staple in my kit. Again, not something I use every single time, but a lot of times I'll start here and then we'll decide if that one's not working, we'll move to another microphone. In the narrative piece I worked on a week and a half ago, this is what the male actor wore with good effect. And I'll put a link to that video once it's done with the edit. Now, the final one we're going to talk about, I don't actually own. I have used it a few times, and it's the Sennheiser MKE2. So this is one of their higher end lavalier microphones. Don't confuse this with the ME2 or the ME2-2. It's the MKE2, and this is a much more expensive mic. So the ME2 I think is $150 or somewhere around there. The MKE2 I think is closer to the $500 range. What do I like about this one? Again, a very durable build. So this cuts really nicely with a lot of very common microphones out in the production sound world, the MKH416 shotgun microphone, for example, or the MKE50, which is also a very popular one. So if you're going to be cutting with those microphones, this can be a really good fit. It does have a fairly bright voicing to it. So for me, I think this is really made to hide under clothing is to sound its very best. But once you do, it comes in pretty nicely next to an MKH416. And likewise, this one does have the replaceable caps to kind of fine-tune the voicing, depending on the person's voice that you're miking and the microphone that you're using and how much clothing you're burying it under. So again, all the samples for these different microphones are available down in the links below if you want to hear what they sound like, at least on my voice and a couple cases in other voices. And let me just talk about one last thing. That the question that I get sometimes, especially in the YouTube culture, it seems like, this is the best such and such when you see all these reviews out there. None of these microphones are the best at anything. They are all different tools that fit different situations. And I think that's how a lot of pros really look at microphone selection. They might have their favorites, yes, but I think most of them also realize that there are certain mics that fit situations better than others. So it's really a situation where you need to be able to choose between them. Now, if someone was going to really nail me down, I probably would say that I typically will start with my Shure TwinPlex mics these days, and then I will swap out to other microphones if I have to. Now, I only have so many Shure TwinPlexes, so if I'm miking more than two people, obviously I have to pull out the other mics. But I really try to listen to the timbre of the different talent and get a microphone that's going to work best for their particular voice. So for example, the Countryman B6, these days I'm more likely to put that on a female or a man that doesn't have a very deep voice if I need to kind of emphasize a little bit of that bass frequency in their voice a little bit more. So on the VT500, that one has a pretty bright sound to it. So again, I like to hide that under clothing when I can. In most cases, I'm probably not going to use it on the outside of clothing quite as much. And a lot of times I can use that on, like I have a man's voice, it's kind of a dark voice. It doesn't have a lot of that articulation frequency or high frequency going on. That may be a better fit in a lot of those cases. Again, in the world of corporate video, when I got to act quickly and I've got someone wearing a button-down shirt, that DPA 4160 is awfully nice because it's just so easy to hide it using just a little button to stick through. So I'll often reach for that first. So hopefully that was helpful for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that. And we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.